Buddy, welcome to week two. Um, I like that it says buddy on the captions. It says hello there. I don't- anyway, I hope that you all had a great weekend. Hope that you had a great Monday off, or ideally a day on. We're kind of reflecting on Dr. King's legacy and working to make positive changes in our community. And today, I hope that you're having another day that is on and shifting toward a focus in our coursework, our Module 2 coursework. So, thank you for the work that you have completed so far in Module 1. I did extend a deadline for some of your first annotation work until today. So, please get that in if you haven't. I'm going to offer now some tips and some additional lecture support, taking just another 5, 6 minutes of your time to help you succeed this week in Module 2. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right. So here you can see our front page, and I want to talk about my to-do list. So this is what my screen looks like, and this is telling me the things that I need to grade that you have submitted. And my goal is to always grade work within 1 week of you submitting it. So you should always expect a grade with the rubric filled out within roughly 7 days of the due date. And if something comes up where I'm sick or it's going to take me longer to move through your materials and offer feedback, then I will be sure to let you know that in an announcement. Otherwise, just look for your grades to start filtering through. Make sure that you review the rubric so that way you understand how you were scored. And then if you have any questions about the grade you received or something that you're not sure how to improve upon, then don't hesitate to email me so that way we can discuss it. So now moving into module two, we're like everything this in this class, we're going to be dealing with some old literature, some ancient world literature. And we have a few graded assignments this week. We'll have a quiz, a reading quiz that works to provide a type of reading check for the things that the core text that we will read this week. We have a discussion that is more of a discussion related to the texts themselves and comparing them. And then we have an assignment that's going to ask us to apply some historical criticism, which will be our first dive into literary analysis. And that will really be the core piece of what I want to make sure that I give you some additional support with this week. So we're going to look at a bunch of older religious texts this week, and we're going to be asked to look at those through a historical lens and think about the times when those texts were written and the cultures in which those texts were written and shared so we can compare them. And this is the estimated time that you have this week for reading, for applying things. Again, these I think are quite generous times that are being given. But as always, make sure you're carving out at least 6 hours of your week to some of your of this class and the reading work that you'll need to use to get through it. So this is the work that we have here. You're going to be reading some pages within our textbook. Remember, you're accessing that through textbooks. You should know that by now. And then we have some short guides on literary analysis and then some pieces on historical and new historicist criticism, which are kind of very, very similar, effectively the same thing, that are asking us to consider the time, the culture, the traditions of a particular writer or an assumed writer, and using that as a way to analyze, investigate, and try to work to make meaning of and apply our analysis to various texts. So you want to follow the same type of annotation work that you have been following in Module 1, right, which I encourage you to use like a Google Docs or to annotate within the textbook itself so that way you can go back to it. I prefer Google Docs just because I write everything in Google Docs, and I encourage you to use Google Docs because it will save automatically, etc. Um, but so you can see here that you've got the Great Hymn to Aten here, a couple pages, and then you're going to be reading some indigenous North American stories on these pages, 117 17 to 27. You have a little bit of West African focus here, some Japanese focus here, and then we get into some Hesiod work uh, at the end. So these are our readings. You can see that the total page numbers to read this week are fewer than last week, right? But there are also some additional things to explore and watch and think about, especially this, what is historical criticism? That will be super important for you to look at to help supplement what you're reading about here from Britannica Online and then this new historicist criticism space that I found and actually updated for us because the original web page to a different source was not working. So I've updated that for us if you have already jumped in here and noticed that there was a dead link. So the big thing that you want to work on is to think about new historicism because this is uh, the core task of your biggest assignment this week, applying historical criticism, new historicist criticism. And your goal is you're going to pick one of those readings that you've moved through and you're going to look at it through an historical lens. So you're going to need to engage with that text further and maybe look up some things about it. If it's a text in time period that you're unfamiliar with, to give you some more understanding of the culture, some more understanding of what was happening in the world during that time. And then you're going to produce some writing about it. Okay, so you want to think about what you're learning about historical criticism and then analyze the story through that lens. So working to connect elements of that story that you're reading of the narrative to specific historical or cultural details from that time, from that culture. It could be about the author. If you know you latch onto an author, some texts won't have clear authors, but there will be general times, and then you're going to want to, of course, cite sources. You can use outside sources for this, and in fact, you might need to. So keep that in mind. And then you have an option for how you want to submit this work to me. You can very classically write what is effectively about a 1.5 page double-spaced essay. So a short essay, I think maybe even less than a page. Now I'm trying to think, is it 500 words? 350 words. Now I'm kind of forgetting, but more, roughly a page of writing as you work to apply a new or historical criticist lens onto a work. And that is the core learning objective this week, to be honest. And I'll stop sharing and try to wrap up our video here. Um, to analyze a text means to look at it and to think about the decisions that the author was making in order to achieve some type of goal that you believe the author intended or that you're able to glean from the text itself, and to work to try to say something that you take away from the text, that you analyze, that you can argue exists because it's there in the text. And we can apply all sorts of different lenses to our analysis, to our analytical process, and we're going to learn about different ones over the course of the term. And right now, we're learning about an historical lens. So, thinking about in history during that time, if we think about what was happening around the creation of that text, what might we glean from that text, or how might that help us to understand the text more fully? So keep those questions in the back of your mind as you read this week. I encourage you to first engage with, an overview of historicism, of historical analysis, new historicism, and think about those questions as you engage with the reading this week in the textbook. And remember that you're going to go back to one of those stories. So think about which one you liked most that you want to spend a little bit more time with, and then move forward. The earliest thing that we have due this week is by the end of the day, Thursday, that you need to complete some reading so that way you can engage with the discussion question. So please jump on reading earlier this week and give your time to that and continue that process of, you know, noting the text you're reading, and after a page or two, pausing to write a quick 1, 2, 3 sentences about it. trying to summarize what's happening there, questions that are popping into your brain. Um, and follow that process so that way you have your a more active reading experience and you're more able to engage with the text in that way. So let me know if you have any thoughts, questions, concerns. I appreciate your time this week. I'm looking forward to diving into your Module 1 materials. And I will reach out again later just with some reminders for the weekend. But until then, take good care. Congrats to all the IU fans out there for the IU football success stuff. And that's it. Look at me. Shorter video this time. Take care, everybody.